Hello, I'm Margaret Graziano with Keen Alignment, where we empower people in gaining organizational traction. For our topic today, we're speaking about organizational performance management, and we have two modules for you. I recently read a statistic that 90% of performance reviews are painful and ineffective. The most common barrier to effective performance management is how both sides of the desk respond to one another during the process. When it doesn't go so well, managers often leave the meeting with the experience of being disappointed, frustrated, or even angry. On the other hand, in the same situation, the employee is often just as triggered. However, the employee's trigger is due to operating in the state of fear. Neither person is present during the conversation because one is angry and the other is afraid. An employee operating in a state of fear or frustration is almost never fully present to what's actually being said in the performance review, and quite often winds up responding to their boss in a defensive and even irresponsible manner. The manager operating in this state of frustration almost always comes off as impatient, harsh, and punitive. It's this scenario that plays out in many managers' thinking so often that many choose to simply avoid performance management at all costs. There are solutions to better performance management. Let's start by introducing you to the 7 levels of individual, group, and organizational effectiveness. If a leader's operating in hopelessness, which is the lowest level, and they've given up on their employee, chances are the employee has also given up on the job, the manager, and maybe even the company. In hopelessness, both parties have a fundamental inability to see a positive path forward. If they're both on the same level and each believe it can't get any better, the performance management conversation may be a moot point. When I see this, I get really curious about how things got to this level of unworkability. I'll address what you can do to avoid this situation towards the end of the module. So let's look up one level. You've got an employee who's been making a lot of mistakes. They're late on deadlines and they know they're struggling in the role. In the operating state of fear, your employee resists feedback, not because they don't believe it to be true, but the feedback could be a reminder of them of everything that's happened in their past that they failed about. And it's one more telltale sign that they're not productive and not valuable. Often people who drop into fear do so because of a patterned response in their brain. Over time, they've developed a neural pathway for how to process feedback. Most often for employees, as soon as they get triggered by performance feedback, their wall automatically goes up and they cannot process what their manager is saying, even if the manager's intent is to try to help the employee get better. The manager, when faced with a low-performing employee, may also be operating in the state of fear. Fear for a number of reasons, like what will happen to me because I have low-performing employees on my team. Fear of failure, fear of not being enough, fear of not addressing the situation sooner. The problem with fear is it paralyzes. The adrenaline and cortisol release into the prefrontal cortex in the state of fear blocks our logical thinking and kind of dumbs us up. I do not recommend engaging in any kind of performance conversation when either the manager or the employee is in a state of fear. After fear, we move into frustration. In the operating state of frustration, the manager is often angry about the lack of performance and its impact on the manager. The manager consciously or unconsciously takes the lack of performance as a personal affront, and her anger shows up in the performance review meeting. The manager could be angry about the time he has invested in the employee or angry about the trust that has been broken between them. It's this state of mind the individual receiving the feedback is going to see, and then they will respond defensively. In the state of frustration, the impulse the brain has is to defend, justify, and blame. Unless the person receiving performance review is highly self-aware and has strong emotional control, they won't let the manager tell them they are wrong. What happens next is often a visit to HR or a performance improvement plan or both. The next stage up the ladder is courage, When performance expectations are clear and the manager stayed connected with the employee and works to ensure there's a solid understanding of what's needed and by when, and they have agreement between each other to deliver a high quality product on time, we're operating in courage. In this operating state, constructive conversations don't have to be difficult because there's no emotion and no mass added to the conversation. In courage, people believe a positive future is possible, and they use their time to work together to seek clarity, to identify constraints and roadblocks to performance, and proactively design agreements that allow both parties to move forward. The operating state of courage is where most new employee-manager relationships begin. We're now at the level of engagement. When one is fully engaged, they're contributing at a high level of effectiveness. The manager's engagement and commitment to the enterprise brings people together. The manager welcomes diverse opinions and inputs and has tolerance for differences, not tolerance for poor performance, but tolerance for differences. Performance expectations are clear and concise, and people know what to do and how to do it. When the environment is in a state of engagement, people are happier and more productive. When employees happen to fall below the power and freedom line, which is typical in any company and could be often, the manager is skilled in seeking and understanding to support the employee in getting back up into courage or engagement. In a state of engagement, there's proactive alignment on the main priorities required to accelerate and even break through performance records. When a performance review takes place from a state of engagement, it's more of a conversation, a collaborative approach to making traction in the organization. Innovation is the next highest level of individual, group, and organizational effectiveness. In the state of innovation, frankly, performance reviews follow non-traditional structure. Rather than waiting for an annual or biannual process, it's a regularly scheduled quarterly or more often meeting between the employee and the manager. We call this a 5-5-5. During the 5-5-5, the manager and the employee discuss 3 topics: core values, role and responsibilities, and rocks, which are the 90-day priorities. When 5-5-5s are done regularly, by the time the annual performance review comes around, it's more of a formality to suffice the company's HR process. Beyond making annual performance reviews easier, the best part is that there's no surprises because both the manager and the employee are on the same page. In the level of effectiveness of synchronicity, the organization and those in it are operating for the greater good. They're all bought in, aligned, and in sync for the bigger vision. The manager understands that mistakes happen and looks for the root cause versus passing blame. The employee is clear on what's needed from her role and takes extreme ownership for producing the outcomes in the role. Whether the employee hits the mark or not, he owns it, and he looks to his manager for guidance and counsel on how to raise the bar. Every organization and every person within it goes up and down the 7 levels every day. What's important here is to take note, to be conscious about where you are at, where your organization is at, where your managers are at, and where your employees are at. When the manager is aware and has awareness of herself and her employees, she can better equip herself to empower people to move into higher levels of effectiveness and empathize when they're not there, so she can learn and understand how to get people more productive. Thank you for joining me today. Be sure to check today's email for a link to our free performance management do's and don'ts guide. I'll leave you with this quote by Douglas Conant. To win in the marketplace, you must first win in the workplace.